Assalamu alaikum and Masa al-Khair. My name is Ihab Ukumi. I'm going to be your Master of Ceremony for tonight. We have a really comprehensive and full program for you tonight, which means we're going to have to run very quickly and you're not going to have any breaks. The good news is you're free to go to the buffet at any time and grab coffee and drinks if you want to. Also like to make sure that you're aware that there is translation. The sets are between the seats. I believe channel 1 is French. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong. There's no Arabic translation, but there's English and French. Tonight, first thing I want to start with is thank everybody that showed up. Especially, I'd like to thank the Mr. Wayne Marston, the Honorable Wayne Marston, for being here and for being extremely responsive and helpful in support of human rights and democracy in Egypt. I'd like to thank Nizam Blanchet for being here as well. The NDP is very well representative tonight, and I think they deserve a hand. Many other MPs have actually wanted to be here, but it's a very busy time of the year, so some will try to be here later on. We hope to see some of them from the different parties. We also have some that showed interest from the Canadian Senate. I believe Senator Jaffer would be with us shortly. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of the Egyptian Coalition, Egyptian-Canadian Coalition for Democracy and Amnesty International, and would like to thank Amnesty for their help in setting this up as well. The program is going to be very quick, very fast-paced. We're going to move from one speaker to another with very, very little intervention. The first thing I want to bring up is a timeline, just to make sure that we're all at the same platform and we all have the same starting point. The first thing we're going to do is play a little video, a few minutes, just to bring everybody up to speed to what has happened and where the Egyptian revolution is at. This will be followed by a very quick commentary from Ihab Lutaif, the ECCD chair, and by the way, I'm not going to fully introduce every speaker that comes up, just in the interest of time, but their bio is going to be on the screen in front of you. So with no further ado, we're going to play a video about the timeline of the Egyptian revolution.
2012. In a single court session, 2 days before second-round presidential elections, the Supreme Constitutional Court declares the lower house unconstitutional, and with lightning speed dissolves the parliament. June 17, 2012. SCAF Constitutional Declaration. SCAF reassumes legislative authority. Shackles the Constituent Assembly. Prevents the President-elect from appointing a Minister of Defense or any SCAF member. June 23, 2012. Presidential election. 13 candidates run. 10 find themselves ousted for various reasons. 2 candidates make it to round 2. Dr. Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate. Army General Shafiq, the last PM of Mubarak era. Morsi wins. Divide and conquer. But politics creates strange bedfellows. The power exchange leaves leftists and liberals fuming. Revolutionary youth beat their breasts at a stolen revolution. Churches caution their flocks. Corrupted businessmen shake in their boots. SCAF plots to use them all like pawns to broker their next power grab. August 12, 2012. Morsi topples SCAF and outmaneuvers them. He cancels SCAF's constitutional declaration and assumes legislative power until the Constituent Assembly drafts a new constitution. He swears former head of military intelligence, General Sisi, in as a Minister of Defense. December 15, 2012. Constitution referendum. The public votes on Egypt's draft constitution. More than 65% say yes, and Egypt adopts it officially. The Shura Council assumes legislative power, but only until the newly elected parliament forms a government under the new constitution. So the chaos begins. Our political bedfellows joined forces to demonize Morsi and topple him. Officials use private media to spread groundless gossip and slander that swells by the day. Army and police protect anti-Morsi crowds in the street. Arsonists set fire to FJP offices countrywide. Chaos reigns. June 30th. Anti-Morsi demonstrations in Tahrir Square, Presidential Palace, and different cities. Pro-Morsi demonstrations at Rabaa El Adawiya Square. July 3rd. Sisi topples Morsi. Shura Council, Parliament Upper House, dissolved. Head of Constitutional Court appointed president. Pro-Morsi supporters decide to continue sit-in. New sit-in by pro-Morsi supporters at Nada Square. Minutes after the military coup statement, channels and newspapers considered pro-Morsi shut down. Leaders of Muslim Brotherhood and their allies arrested. Morsi himself detained in an unknown place until now. Egyptians hotly debated one question: revolution or a coup? Oh, it's a coup. Sisi massacres. Nada Square, July 3rd, 23 killed. Republican Guard Club, July 8th, at least 56 killed. Ramsey Square, July 10th, at least 10 killed. Mansoura City, July 20th, 3 women and 7 men killed. Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, July 27th, at least 72 killed. Rabaa Massacre, August 14th. Rabaa and Nada sit-ins attacked. At least 1,000 killed, thousands wounded, and thousands arrested. More massacres. Ramsey Square, August 16th, 103 killed. Abu-Zahra prison, August 18th. 38 killed after tear gas bomb thrown into deportation car carrying detained demonstrators. Near Tahrir Square, October 6th, at least 51 killed. So now we have a new pharaoh in the making. The outcome? Thousands killed in the biggest massacre in Egyptian modern history. Tens of thousands persecuted. Return to police state. UAE and Saudi donate billions to support the coup. A complicit international community turns its head, while the Egyptian dream of freedom is at stake. How much bloodshed will it take? When will you step forward?
Or ECCD. And I know what you have with life is eager to comment on the year of President Morsi, but I'm going to ask him to wait just a few minutes because one of the issues about this program is going to be very fluid and very dynamic. That I promise you. When Marston has to actually attend to a vote in Parliament, something that I didn't know that they are called on the spot to be there, but he probably can tell us a little bit more about it. So we're going to ask him to make sure that we're able to listen attentively and give him enough time. I'm going to ask him to come first to address us, and then that will be followed by a presentation from Ihab Latif. Wayne Marston.
Assalamu alaikum. I like to pause after that because it always sounds so good to me, the response. I must say it's an interesting gathering. Sarah, it's good to see you again. Hopefully in the future we'll have things to celebrate, but right now we're all very nervous about the situation. I think this is a very apropos day to have this gathering because of the election happening in Egypt as we speak. It is strange to me that we had a democratic election there, as I recall, and then a military coup, and the situation I'm not going to go into in depth because you're going to have all kinds of information provided for you here tonight. I just want to say that as a member of the official opposition of the New Democratic Party, I'm pleased to help facilitate this meeting tonight. It's a very important conversation. I mean, the roots of all of this is democracy in Egypt, but also it reflects back to Canada because there's so many people who are from Egypt who live in our country now as Canadians. And of course your heart's pulled back to Egypt when you see the things happening there. So it's a conversation of democracy that Canadians must have. So I want to thank you again for putting this together. It's very, very important. Thank you very much.
I actually would like to thank the House of Commons for having us in this wonderful venue tonight, very befitting of the topic that we discuss and the importance of the topic to both Canada and Egypt. The environment here definitely allow us to explore the issues that our speakers will be talking about. Without any delay, I'm going to ask Ihab Al-Taif to come up here. And Ihab's talk is going to be about the year of democracy explored. Let me just say very quickly, just to set expectations, the issues in Egypt are very complex, and it's unrealistic for us to think that we're going to understand all the issues or analyze them. So what we hope to do here, what the speakers will try to do, is pique your interest, challenge your mindset if there is one, and hopefully provide an alternative to what you've been hearing, seeing, or reading in the media. Ihab Al-Taif.
Good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. I am very happy to be here today to address you in the name of the Egyptian Canadian Coalition for Democracy. We're sitting here today as it is supposedly we woke up this morning expecting it to be the second and last day of the Egyptian presidential elections, so-called elections, which is really closer to a farce, or if you're really optimistic, a referendum. The situation in Egypt right now is that there is no atmosphere for possible democracy in any way. All I want to do is to comment on what we heard in the beautiful video that was prepared by our friends in Peace Medan. The situation right now is a situation where all opposition is either killed, imprisoned, in jail, or not allowed to express itself because there are no venues for it to express itself. At the same time, what led us to the situation we're in right now was a period of lack of cooperation by a state that in Arabic is referred to as the deep state, Dawla al-Amiqa. Mubarak left in February of 2011, but really there were a group of beneficiaries that can be numbered in the tens or maybe hundreds of thousands in many high positions in government institutions, not the least in the army, the police, security forces, and even in ministries like the Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, who refused totally to cooperate with the democratic process, and more so refused to cooperate with the democratically elected president. So the year that democracy took place in Egypt, the year between the election of Mohammed Morsi and the toppling of Mohammed Morsi by a military in cooperation with interest groups, coup d'etat, was really a year of democracy from one side. And an objective observer would see that from the side of the government, there was unprecedented openness in the press and the freedom of speech to a very large extent that I would venture to say it was unheard and unparalleled in the history of Egypt before. And I'm sadly going to say that that itself may have been one of the reasons that the coup d'etat managed to take place in Egypt. Because the media that was free to criticize Morsi wasn't only criticizing Morsi, but was in cooperation with interest groups setting the stage for setting a very limited, although for a couple of days it was numerous, protest movement that went to the streets in the 30th of June. Within that period, the real face of the forces that were plotting to topple democracy in Egypt, and I'm not going to say topple a certain president, because I don't think that that was really the goal. It's not about ideology, it was about democracy versus control of the country by military and interest groups. This limited protest in the streets did not take shape or form that would lead to a real toppling of a presidency, but it was used, and looking backwards, hindsight is 2020, it was predetermined and pre-planned to be used by the military, by Sisi and those who conspired with him to take over the country, claiming, and they still claim shamelessly, that it was a revolution, not a coup d'etat. The democratic process, or the so-called democratic process that we are seeing right now, is impossible to take place in an atmosphere that we are seeing right now. And that's what we are here really to talk about. What is the future of Egypt? How can we expect any respect to whoever it is that could be elected or chosen by a process that we see happening today, when all opposition is silenced, when anybody can only toe the party line and cannot be allowed to be in the game if he or she does not accept that July 3rd was a revolution? How can we expect that there can be a democracy? I will not take more of your time right now. We will, and I encourage you all to stay to the question and answer period, because we can exchange in that period after the presentations, where we can explore more on this issue. I will leave you to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
I want to bring your attention to the kit folder that you have received upon entry. There are a number of articles there that should pique your interest. The authors of those articles have a lot of material that is readily available on YouTube and in the print media. So I encourage everyone that has received a folder to go through it, and it would definitely provide a little bit of a different or alternative understanding to the situation in Egypt. Anyone that is interested in human rights and democracy in Egypt, especially Western governments, and more in particular our government here, the government in Canada, needs to take a quick look and a quick second look at their foreign policy. And there is no one better to provide that sobering second thought than a senator from the Canadian Senate. I'm going to ask Mubina Jaffer, Liberal Senator, to address you in the next few minutes. Mubina Jaffer.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. It's a real pleasure to be here, and to my brothers and sisters and friends and ladies and gentlemen, I am no representative of the government. I am a Liberal senator, and my party doesn't want me, so I'm not speaking for anybody, but as part of a group, I believe I'm part of you, and so when I was asked to speak, I felt really blessed to be here. So I don't speak for anybody, but I'm part of you, and I want to for a second share with you that from a young child I'm born in Uganda, and so in Africa, and so I was absolutely in awe of Egypt, because my spiritual leader, His Highness Sultan Mahmud Shah, is buried in Aswan, and then one of my most amazing trips to Egypt was with my mother, and I was very nostalgic. I've had many trips with my mother, many conferences, so I have a very soft spot for that, but also, as some of you know, I was Canada's envoy to the Sudan for many years, and every time I went to Sudan, I first stopped in Egypt and got a briefing from the people that I worked with in Egypt, the Egyptians I worked with, and then when I came back and I would speak to them, and they would ask me, where did you go? And I would say, well, you know where I went. Let's talk about what we do, because a lot of them were security service people, so they would know. So I've had lots of involvement during Mubarak with his wife as well, but most importantly with the women. And to offend anyone here, but during Mubarak's period, us women had difficulties. During Morsi's period, we've had difficulties, and our challenges continue. And I believe that, as our previous speaker is very involved in Gaza, I also do a lot of work in the Middle East, and I also used to do a lot of work in Israel. And in Israel they have a saying for the very extreme Orthodox people where they say that, together on the, together in the bank and alone in the tank, because those most extreme people's children did not go to war. And so I say, when I speak to my Muslim brothers and sisters, don't say together in the protest and alone in the power. And that's what's happening to Egyptian women. And I'm very blessed that I'm part of a group that we are 5 Muslim women from around the world that the Norwegian, German, and Swiss government have brought together. And they asked us what we think, what should be happening, what we should be doing, how should we be acting, how we can help women, Muslim women in the Middle East. And we all are of the one opinion is nobody can help, we have to empower the women. And so one of the things that we have done is that every year we have a conference in Turkey. We bring women, many Egyptian women definitely, and other women from all over the world, all over the Muslim world. And the one thing we do is we ask them to write of their reality. We ask them, we empower them, we help them write, we help them to learn how to write and how to get their voice across. And I highly recommend to you, because I won't have the time to go through the whole paper that the Egyptian women have written about their struggle. And if you go on the website, it's called ICAN, International Civil Action Network website. The whole paper is there setting out the struggles of the women. And so I say to my brothers and sisters here, my friends, my ladies and gentlemen, that in all of this, don't forget my sisters. Don't forget that they're fighting with you, and then when you come into power, you think they need to go back home. And I want to share a few things that in this paper that they have said, because I feel they're not here today, so I should be their voice from there. And is that, and I do realize some of you may be from Egypt, so I'm not being disrespectful of anybody, but the women I work with is who I'm talking about, is that the women tell us, and this is what they have written, the demand for gender equality is deeply rooted in Egyptian history and society, but it was framed under the Mubarak era. Women's political representation is tokenistic. Language leaked out of the constitution offers little protection for women's rights, and whether and how the new leadership responds to women's concerns and demands will be critical in the country's future prospects. The challenges, there are many, but I won't go into details because you do know them. One is there is no security for women. Women caught between militarism and religious extremism. 2, fighting for rights and equality for women. They say, these are their words, and I highly recommend you read the paper. They are saying a progressive past, a regressive future. And many times the women are labeled as Suzanne Mubarak's laws. They're seen as what Suzanne Mubarak was doing, and they resent that because that's not what it is about. And women's rights were watered down in a leaked text of the draft constitution, and the parliamentary elections serve as a barometer for women in political arena. I want to leave, before I conclude, because I know there are many more speakers and I'm looking forward to hearing from them. Before I conclude, I want to leave this one thought with you. I want you to be very, very uncomfortable, because I want always that you not forget the work of my sisters. And when Tahrir Square happened, and when my sisters and mothers were in the square, they were very much welcome because they were seen as part of Egyptians coming out and protesting, and they were welcomed as numbers. But we, women from outside who are part of the group and women from inside, had to make sure that there were patrols. If the women phoned, they were being assaulted, hurt, they needed to be protected. And that's even when they were protesting, the women were being hurt. And I recently was in that area, and I won't tell you where because I don't want to identify the women. I met with women who had gone through virginity tests. And I tell you, I have been to many conflict areas. I have been working in this area for 40 years. And what has happened to those women is absolutely unacceptable, what the military has done to them recently. And nobody should forget that these virginity tests are not virginity tests. They are torture tests. And it's unacceptable. My brothers and sisters, when you talk about democracy, when you talk about coalition, remember that to have real democracy, my sisters have to be part of it. My sisters are in the struggle with you, and do not forget when you get power, because without them being there, we will never get true democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Jaffer. We have two international speakers that would have liked nothing better but to be with us tonight. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, they weren't able to make it. But they did allow us to play some of their lectures, or a portion of their lectures. And I'm going to start with Dr. Maha Azam. And we have about 5 minutes of one of her lectures where she talks about what is really happening in Egypt. Label was actually in a title by Kenan Makia that was in the 1990s when he was describing the full-fledged dictatorship, a totalitarian regime of Saddam Hussein. The fact that Maha Azam is using the same term should really open our eyes to what's really happening in Egypt. The next speaker needs no introduction. She uses the term campaigner, and that really describes what she does. The next speaker represents an organization that has written in the last month alone about 15 reports in Egypt. With no further ado, I'm going to ask Hilary Holmes to address us. Hilary Holmes.
Right. I was so focused on the chairs, I didn't notice the stuff. Thank God that's just water. Yeah, so there you go, that's me. Good evening. What I'm going to do is provide an overview of some of the patterns of human rights violations that we've been documenting, and it will certainly echo some of what's already been said, and anticipate, I'm sure, more things that will be said this evening. So I don't know how many of you read today's Globe and Mail, but there was an article about the elections there, and there were a couple of quotes that caught my eye. Both were directed at the media by a presidential candidate. You can probably guess which one. And here they are. The first one was, "Get behind the strategic goal and protect the Egyptian state." The second one was, "It is better to whisper in the ears of officials about a problem than to make a big noise about it." And the meaning of these is clear for freedom of expression in Egypt. It doesn't exist. There's no place for criticism. Don't challenge the narrative that is out there right now. The same candidate also expressed caution about the pace of democratic reforms. Perhaps 25 years might get there. Change, admittedly, takes time, but we can only hope that was a misquote. Sadly, I really don't think it was. I expect many of you were on Parliament Hill in February 2011, February 12th. It was a global day of action that became a rather spontaneous celebration after Mubarak resigned. He resigned the day before. And how many of you were there, by the way? You missed a great party, the rest of you. I've never seen Pyramid Cake. It was great. The rendition of Waving Flag was unique, and I'll never forget it. But it was this sort of feeling of incredible hope, and I've been in a lot of demonstrations over the years in a lot of places, and that was a very unforgettable afternoon. So for me and so many others, what's happening right now in Egypt, sort of 3 years later, is a real betrayal of what we were feeling that afternoon. It's an incredible betrayal of that hope. And sadly, human rights violations are are again on the increase. None of the presidential candidates, interestingly, of course, have pledged any human rights reforms or any action to hold anyone accountable for any abuses that have happened recently or in the past. The security situation in Egypt, as we all know, is fragile and indeed deteriorated in the months following the ousting of Morsi. Army checkpoints, security personnel, government buildings, they've all come under attack. Hundreds have reportedly been killed. Attacks have also been directed at ordinary citizens. And from our point of view, it's the responsibility of the state to protect the security of people, to protect the right to life, and to bring anyone responsible for attacks to justice. In particularly arbitrary attacks, but any attacks. However, in doing this, any government, Egypt included, must not use this as an excuse for a crackdown on freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. But that's exactly what we're seeing, as some of the speakers have already said. The figures, everyone's got slightly different figures, but we know that at least 1,400 people have died in protests and political violence. There have been other deaths outside of those contexts. Thousands of people are languishing in detention. We've received new reports of torture and other ill treatment in police stations and prisons, including military prisons, as well as deaths in custody. We're particularly concerned about conditions of detention that have amounted to enforced disappearance, secret detention, because what happens in that context is forced confessions, and where they're used during the grossly unfair trials we've also been documenting, where civilian courts have sentenced hundreds of people to death. Military courts have tried journalists for criticizing the army. We're really concerned about the mass trials where everyone's under the same charge, but there's little or no actual evidence of individual criminal responsibility in that context. And as we know, some of these trials have resulted in hundreds of death sentences, which may or may not change, but that is not a good situation. The authorities have arbitrarily restricted freedoms of expression, association, and assembly, and this kind of widening crackdown that is targeted both supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and others who are critical of the interim authorities. Now, as I said before, criticism is just not on. This has included journalists, political activists, and human rights organizations. In this context, of course, we're really concerned about the continued efforts to suppress the work of human rights organizations. They're the ones that help us document the violations. You shut them down. We're never going to be a big fan of that. So what we're seeing is unreasonable restrictions on registration, funding, activities, drafting legislation that will further curtail freedom of expression, and a lot of crackdowns on the activities. Including last week, the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights was raided for the second time. 15 people were detained. A lot were beaten up in this context. There were allegations of sexual violence in this situation as well, as part of a broader pattern that we see repeating. As I said, that's the second time in 6 months that they've been raided. We're also seeing broader new restrictions imposed on freedom of assembly. Last November, many of you will probably know, there was a new law limiting protests. It gives the Interior Ministry very wide-ranging powers over demonstrations, forcing organizers to register what they're doing 72 hours in advance of staging any demonstration. It also has given broad powers to disperse demonstrations. So this is what we're seeing happening, whether it's political groups or human rights groups. A lot of defendants are being dispersed, including through excessive use of force. And ironically, this has involved protests about the protest law being dispersed. A lot of that's what's been in the media. There's some other violations that haven't been in the media that I really want to mention. One is the continuing forced evictions of people, leaving them homeless. The forced return of refugees and asylum seekers, including people who fled the conflict in Syria, being returned back. And discrimination and violence against women and minorities. And Mobina, just moments ago, spoke very eloquently about the patterns of violations we're continuing to see there, including the women being targeted around Tahrir Square. And again, the portrayal of the hope and promises made to them. I really want to thank you for your comments. So instead of accountability for the human rights violations, what we're seeing is the granting of further powers that will just pave the way to further abuses. This new law on protests is really concerning because it authorizes the use of lethal force, firearms, against peaceful protesters. They're also finalizing new counterterrorism legislation. We're really concerned about the patterns that we see here because in practice it's likely to be targeted against government opponents. It's really undermining safeguards against arbitrary arrest and torture and expanding the scope and application of the death penalty. We've also seen sort of new Constitution championed, but at the same time, the safeguards that are in there around torture are being routinely disregarded, so really wondering about the value of that document. In this context, we're really concerned about the ongoing and resumed arms sales to Egypt. Part of it is around the equipment used to control protests, so tear gas and so on. The EU had called for a ban on this equipment. We're worried that the elections will sort of give cover to returning to normalcy, resume these. As was mentioned earlier, the Obama administration is looking to normalize relations again. That includes resuming, over $600 million worth of military aid, although there are some people in the US Congress that are trying to block this. So, just to end on the note that neither the new government or Egypt partners should use the fact that there are elections happening yet again as a cover to return to business as usual, because business as usual is just yet another cycle of repression and human rights violations. We're calling on whatever the new government is to uphold human rights. What this means is ending impunity, providing justice for the victims and their families, making sure investigations take place, making sure they're impartial, and making sure they're public. We're also really concerned that Egypt hasn't allowed access to a lot of UN special mechanisms, the human rights experts and the special procedures. They've been waiting for years to get into the country to document violations. They really need to be allowed in now. And the international community, including Canada, needs to support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary, and thank you again for coming up to the podium. To introduce the next speaker, we're privileged to have her with us tonight. As you probably realize by now, I'm lexically challenged in both official languages, but more so in one. So to briefly introduce the next speaker, I enlisted the help of someone else, and nothing less than a PhD in international development would do for me. So Dr. Nadia Abu-Zahra will introduce les enveloppes.
C'est un vrai plaisir d'introduire Madame Lisanne Blanchette, députée. Elle vient de présenter une pétition très importante au Parlement aujourd'hui. I ask you all please to join me in welcoming a Member of Parliament who introduced a crucial petition on Canada's role in Egypt today in Parliament, Madame Lisanne Blanchette.
I will have to run to the House of Commons for a vote, and as I'm 6 months pregnant now, I don't run as fast as I used to, so I just want to say a few words. Thank you very much for the kind presentation. Indeed, I presented a petition, a very important petition, today in the House of Commons to bring to the attention to the House of Commons the violations of human rights, of democracy, and of course of freedom of press and expression, freedom of expression in Egypt. I think it's important that we keep this discussion alive here on Parliament Hill and in the Parliament inside the House of Commons. So thank you to ECCD for putting this evening very interesting panel, experts and people together in Ottawa to make sure we continue to talk about it, raise the issues, and make sure we are ready to continue to be involved and to talk about this very concerning situation. So unfortunately I will have to leave you, but thank you very much once again for being here.
In the last few weeks, Sarah Atiyah is the wife of, the Canadian wife of the Khalid Qazaz, the person who was detained in Egypt and remains detained in Egypt. With no further ado, I'm going to ask Sarah to come and say a few words.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here today to share with you my family's ordeal, a story that is one among thousands of horrific stories, but unique in its own way. A story of injustice, oppression, fear, and tyranny, but also a story of hope and optimism for the future. I apologize in advance for those who have heard my story before, but I will continue to say it until Khalid comes home. My name is Sarah. I was born in Mississauga and grew up in a wonderful neighborhood just outside of Toronto. I'm the mother of 4 Canadian children. Abdurrahman is 8, Amina is 6, Fatima is 4.5, and Tahrir, our little one, who we named after Tahrir Square, is 2. She was our little symbol of freedom, liberation, and hope for democracy. I am the wife of Khalid al-Fazaz, my husband, who has been unjustly detained in Cairo's worst prison. Today marks 329 days. I am not a politician. I'm not even married to one. My children and I, our family, are survivors and an eyewitness of the bloody military coup in Egypt. Khalid and I met while we were both students at the University of Toronto. Khalid was an activist and an advocate for human rights, and he had huge dreams. He dreamed of a better a better world for all humanity. He started a group on campus back at the University of Toronto 10 years ago called Students for World Justice. He also founded an orphan sponsorship program that's been running for 10 years now. He left an imprint on all those who met him, and he was like a sponge as he absorbed concepts of principles of freedom, democracy, and tolerance that were so foreign to that day Egyptian society. I'm here today to allow you to see a contrast between the country that my husband Khalid worked so hard to build and today. After we got married, we decided to go to Egypt to begin a project in education. We founded a school together that provided Egyptian children with quality education. We introduced our students to concepts of volunteerism, community, and individual rights, human rights. In 2011, Khalid, like many Egyptian young men and women, had become increasingly frustrated in Egypt, and on January 25th, he was among the first ones in Tahrir Square. He spent the 18 days there until Mubarak was ousted. The world stood watching, and as Hilary described, the world cheered, and everyone regained hope in the future. Khalid was extremely excited about the opportunity for democracy in Egypt. He was young, just 32 at the time, full of energy, and jumped on the chance to make a difference. He joined the presidential campaign for Dr. Morsi and was part of the media team, and he did a very good job at what he did. They won the first free democratic elections in Egypt, and the world celebrated. Khalid was appointed as part of the presidential team staff. He worked on files of foreign affairs, human rights, and he was working on a big file on women empowerment. And he worked very hard. For 1 year, my children and I watched as Khalid spent over 15-hour days working hard to overcome the years of corruption to build a democratic Egypt. He had dreams. Joe Stork, the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch, had this to say about Khalid. And he says, I met Khalid along with other presidential aides. Khalid was the go-to person when we wanted to raise issues about developing new important legislation on things like the rights of NGOs to organize and operate without government micromanagement. He was trying to change things. This is what Mr. Stork had to say. This is what Khalid was doing for stability in Egypt. On July 3rd, 2013, this all came to an end. On that day of the military coup, which happened to be Khalid's 34th birthday, we lost contact with him. My husband, the president, and 8 other aides disappeared. We spent almost 2 months not knowing anything about them, except a few phone calls that told us he was alive. My children asked me what happened to their father and why he wasn't coming home. Their eyes were full of sadness and confusion as they remembered their father and how he was telling them that he was fixing Egypt. I struggled to look back into their eyes and explain to them the concepts of injustice, oppression, and evil. I struggle till today to explain to their little spirits and not let them lose hope in humanity. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International both documented Khalid's case as a detainment as enforced disappearance, and they called it incommunicado. The United Nations Human Rights Council concluded in a working paper that the detainment was unlawful and Khalid should be released immediately. He remained in this state for 5 months. On December 17th, Khalid was moved to the maximum security facility in Cairo, up to our prison called Scorpion. At least now we were part of the legal system. He was a number. When he was initially moved to Torah, those were the scariest days of my life. I had no idea where he was, what was being done to him, and what would happen to him. When I finally heard from him 3 weeks later, I received a torn piece of paper bag that described the horrible conditions that he was subjected to. He described how he was handcuffed, blindfolded, and led at gunpoint from the Republican Guard building where he had been held for 5 months and taken to the maximum security facility in Torah, to a solitary confinement cell that he refers to as the grave. That's about 2 meters by 2 meters. It has no windows to outside light. There was a very small opening facing the hallway that caused cold waves to come in during the winter and insects to come into the cell. The cell includes a non-functioning toilet and a sink, nothing else. Khaled spent the first 21 days in 24-hour solitary confinement with nothing except the concrete floor and a toilet. He was, just imagine, he had nothing, no change of clothes, nothing, no human interaction, nothing. It has been 329 days. Due to the horrific conditions, my husband's health is deteriorating quickly. The poor sleeping conditions have resulted in Khaled developing an issue with the nerves in his neck. The medical condition has worsened, resulting in loss of mobility in his left arm. During my visits, when I was able to visit him a few months later, I have realized the effect of the torture of solitary confinement has had on him. I have observed a change in his ability to focus, short attention span, a difference in his concentration and memory. He complains of dizziness, headaches, and problems with sleeping. When I first saw him after the first long period of solitary, I observed a change in his skin color and complexion. This is how it started, and the last 5 months have not been much better. Prison visits are few and inconsistent and from behind a glass window. My children had no physical contact with their father. He is not able to hug them or kiss them. After some pressure through human rights organization, I was able to have my children hug their father for a few seconds in the last visit before we left Cairo. Tahrir is almost 2. She learned to crawl, walk, talk, and now run, and her father saw none of that. When she saw him for the first time after the long disappearance, she did not recognize him and she refused to go to him. It was heartbreaking for all of us. For the last 329 days, I have witnessed tragedy after tragedy. News of deaths of friends, imprisonment, harassment, corruption, lies, threats, and the list goes on. Our family has been subjected to continuous targeting. Khalid's elderly father has been imprisoned without charge for no reason. Our lives have been torn apart. And we are just one example of what Egypt is going on now. In my waits in prison lines at Torah, I have met families who have suffered horrific injustices. I have seen boys, young boys, wearing prison suits and in adult prisons. I have seen men in wheelchairs being taken from one jail to the other. I know personally many women who have been incarcerated for no reason except joining a protest or being related to an imprisoned person. I know personally women who have been subjected to the virginity test, and the list goes on. Khalid has been held without charge, I must say, for the last 320 days. The Egyptian legal system allows for the prosecution to renew detainment time after time after time for up to 5 months. He was seen by a judge last week for the first time. The judge listened to him and his lawyer, and without giving any explanation, he renewed once again for 45 days, without charge, without reason, without any end in sight. I ask my Canadian community, my Canadian family, what crime has my family done to be ignored? What crime have my children done to suffer like this? What crime has Egypt done to be left in suffering, oppression, and be forgotten? What crime has Khalid done, my husband? Is he being punished for working so hard for human rights, dreaming of democracy in Egypt and a better world? Although several MPs have expressed support, and Minister Baird is aware of my situation, our situation, and brought it up to his Egyptian counterparts, and I'm grateful for that, Khalid has not come home yet. I know for a fact that it will be impossible for Khalid to be treated in a fair manner consistent with international standards. I'm calling on our Canadian government to recognize the human rights violations and speak up on the lack of due process taking place in Egypt, which Canada is considering as a bilateral partner. I will close off this message. With a message that I received yesterday. Yesterday, the first day of the elections. Myself and many others who have suffered so much, as we watch the world accept this loss of freedom and democracy and celebrate it, we felt a sense of despair, and I received this message of hope. They can arrest our bodies, but they cannot arrest our dreams, hearts, and souls. Nothing lasts forever. It will be over soon, and we will use this history, this experience, this blessing in disguise, with all its pains and sorrows to our favor, God willing. Khaled Al-Qazzaz, Scorpion Maximum Security Facility, May 2014. Thank you.
I would just account that definitely brings the issues to the forefront, and our thoughts and prayers are with you and your children, and we hope that very soon Tahrir will realize the meaning of her name, and Egypt will realize the meaning of Tahrir's name. While you're reading the bio of the next speaker, let me just give you a thought that took place in Egypt when I visited Egypt, and just to talk about the aspirations and the dreams of the young people in Egypt. One of the 16-year-old actually asked me at one time if I knew the difference between democracy and liberal democracy. And definitely at 16 I had no idea what the terms mean. So this is evident that the young people in Egypt aspire to a better world, and they became so interested in politics. The whole of Egypt became so interested in politics to the point where Dr. Saif Abdel Fattah said that it became, the environment became one of political intoxication. And when there is political intoxication, the role of the media becomes much, much more important. The next speaker is going to tell us how the media played a major role in the myth that came before the 3rd of July coup and after. With Dr. Mohammed Morsi, I'll leave you with his lecture. Thank you. Canada's response to the events in Egypt has been, to say the least, an interesting one. And it is of interest to all of us to find out how our country and our government has responded to the events in Egypt. For some, it has taken them by surprise. For others, it was something that they intentionally reacted to in a way and a manner that is not representative of what all Canadians want. To explain to us how Canada responded to the events in Egypt, I'm going to ask Dr. Nadia Abu-Zahra to address us. Thank you.
I'll begin with a quote, and you have to guess. You can raise your hands even if you want. You have to guess who gave us this quote. As Canadians, we cannot simply hope. We must help. We cannot simply applaud change. We must act. That was said on March 16th, 2011, by our Foreign Affairs Minister, Lawrence Kennan. It was a time when we dispersed and decided to disperse $11 million for the development of democratic institutions in Egypt and the Middle East. Canada stood for democracy, youth, education, and women, the economy, and justice. Over 83 million people in Egypt, a quarter of whom are youth, and a fifth who live on less than $2 a day, were very glad to hear these words. Canada also stood for freedom, especially freedom of the press. Speaking of Canada's over $500,000 in aid, Foreign Affairs Minister Lawrence Kennan said, Canada is also committed to supporting journalists in Egypt as they prepare to play a crucial role in the upcoming elections and referendum process. When General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi took power, Canada called a spade and a coup. This was an extremely powerful message on behalf of all of us Canadians to the 83 million Egyptians who had seen their democratically elected president removed by force by a man known for his sordid history of torture and the beating to death of Egyptian youth. The same man would become associated with massacres and mass trials and mass detentions. Forbes calls General Sisi a pharaoh. The New York Times draws cartoons mocking his judiciary, and Egyptians had never seen such a reign of terror. In July of last year, Canada stood with those 83 million Egyptians, and 3 years ago, Canada supported democracy. What has happened in the last 3 years should give us even more reason to continue our support for democracy. but instead we as Canadians have withdrawn. When we express our sympathies with the murdered and wounded in Egypt, we are religiously selective. Why? When we witness atrocities, we are silent. Why? When not only Egyptian but even Canadian journalists are taken captive, we forget our promises, our principles, and our commitments to journalists. Why? When Canadian families, women, children, and elderly fear the worst for their loved ones in solitary confinement in the world's worst prisons, Canada is immobilized. Why? We, as our MPs and ministers keep repeating, stand for stability. But security experts in Canada, the United States, and across the world, people like State Department officials, risk consultancy firms, and former diplomats repeat, these experts repeat, very serious warnings about repressing 83 million Egyptians and their hopes for freedom, democracy, and tolerance. These experts say that supporting a coup is not the route to stability. Forbes magazine writes, underwriting the slaughter of innocents will ultimately have disastrous consequences for US security. We as Canadians should take heed of these words of warning. If Canadian policy is to support stability, then what are we doing standing silent as our own citizens are in solitary confinement and all the world predicts economic and political downfall under the brutal fist of the military dictatorship? Where is the stability in 41,163 arrested, 7,000 killed, and 100,000 placed on blacklists for death or detainment? Is this stability? Are these Canadian principles? We in Canada have the power to change these things. We have the power to make this world a better place. We have the power to stand up and be proud as Canadian, as the bearers of the flag of freedom, democracy, and human rights. The longer we leave that flag crumpled on the ground, the longer we mar our own reputation and compromise our own values and principles. Let us stand together, all parties, all voters, all people, you and me, and assert Canada's position in defence of the human rights of our Canadian families and of all Egyptians, irrespective of creed, faith, gender, or age. Let us do what is in our hands to do.
For those passionate words, I think a university professor, I'm not at liberty to mention his name, has summed it up in a couple of phrases when he wrote to me saying that Canada's position is either evil or ignorant, and I'm not sure which one I like. Having ECCD tried to reach out to MPs to share the facts on the ground with them, and one of the reactions we have received was really stunning. The reaction was, why are you talking to us and criticizing us? What have the Americans done? What have the British done? And what choices do we have? And it's a question that we have to ask. Do they have any other choices? And to help us understand that, I'm going to ask Dr. Wael Haddara to talk about the choices that Western governments, and in particular the government of Canada, has. Wael Haddara.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here, although pleasure is being used rather loosely given the context, that's certainly a privilege. It's going to be very hard for me to follow Dr. Abu-Zahra's diction and delivery, but so please try to block that last presentation from your minds. I want to organize my comments around 3 points. The first is just a very, very brief set of remarks about our year in office. And I use that term very deliberately. It was a year in office, not in power. There's a difference between the two. I want to talk about the experiences that we've had since the coup with other governments, and then I'm going to close with a brief perspective on what we should be trying to do here in Canada. My involvement with the administration of Mohammed Morsi is a matter of the public record. There's a piece in the London Free Press that was published if you want to refer to how I got involved with this. Very briefly, it was actually through Khaled Khazaz, who was a good friend of mine during his time here in Canada and roped me into this, for which I am very grateful. I think it was an incredibly important exercise. As Sarah talks about Khaled, the idea that we could actually try to rebuild a country was an incredibly motivating idea. And I would not say that we have failed. I would not yet say that we have failed. Much was done, and I think the history is still being written. When I assess our performance in the past, in the year of the presidency of Mohammed Morsi, I always say that we made many mistakes. People usually ask me, do you not think that there were many mistakes made? And I say yes. And for every mistake that you can tell me, I can give you 3. Mine are usually better because I was there. So without a doubt, we made many mistakes. But the issue really was, were these mistakes anything out of the ordinary in terms of a society in transition, a society that is emerging from 60 years of repression towards an uncertain democracy? And what is the remedy for those mistakes? And whatever you may think of our performance, I think it is very clear that what we are going through at the moment is infinitely worse. Egypt is not more stable or more secure or in a happier place than it was under the presidency of Mohammed Morsi. There were elections, parliamentary elections that were coming up and were being held up only by the very man who is now president of Egypt, the head of the Supreme Constitutional Court. And if those elections were allowed to go forward and Mohammed Morsi or his Freedom and Justice Party were truly as deeply unpopular as people say, then we would have seen that get reflected in the parliamentary elections, hence also in who gets to form government. And we would have had a prime minister that would have been able to more correctly represent the will of the people, if that was really the case. I will say only one other thing about the issue of our year in office because it was raised, and that is the role of women. We are very proud, and Khaled was a main driver of this, to have introduced women to the presidency of the Arab Republic of Egypt. In the last 60 years, there has never been a woman serving in the presidential palace in any capacity whatsoever, let alone in the senior capacities in which Mohammed Morsi appointed women. We have an assistant to the president, that's the rank of deputy prime minister. That is the first ever in the history of Egypt. Our coordinator for a nascent think tank that Khaled helped establish, called the Egyptian Foreign Policy Forum, was a woman. Our human rights coordinator in the presidency was a woman. These are all master's or PhD level scholars, people with extensive experience in their field of work. And in fact, our senior foreign media coordinator was also a woman. People, it really and truly took the other staff who were essentially left over from the military. Almost all of the presidency staff was military. It took them a long time to adjust to the idea that there are actually women who are working in the presidential office. I do not say this to imply that there were no issues or that women's rights in Egypt are at a satisfactory place. They're not. But like many other things, the challenge that we face with respect to equality, with respect to tolerance, with respect to respect for women and their role and what they can bring, is a deeply complicated problem that has arisen over many, many years and will not be resolved over time. And most importantly, will not be resolved by decree. It requires a societal dialogue. It requires conversations. It requires leadership, for sure, by a responsive and responsible presidency and legislature, but fundamentally it requires stability. And that's one of the things that we have had less and less and less of over the last year. The president used to say that we are going through a bottleneck, and our challenge is to pass through that bottleneck without the bottle breaking. What the army has done effectively over the last 10 months is do just that. Since the coup, I have traveled to a number of countries, predominantly Europe, Washington, D.C. as well. And as I was mentioning to one of our colleagues before the event, I have yet to meet anyone in foreign relations in any country, whether it is Malaysia, whether it is the various European countries, or DC. I've yet to meet anyone who believes that this regime is stable or sustainable. And in fact, many countries are calibrating what they feel is a difficult situation accordingly. The United Kingdom, despite the position that they've taken on the Muslim Brotherhood and the pressure that they've come under, have withheld export licenses for weapons that can be used to suppress Egyptians. Other countries, Germany, for example, has also prevented a shipment of weapons going to Egypt. The pronouncements, at least the official pronouncements of the European Union, if you look at the Council of Europe, have been extremely negative. They have referred to unprecedented repression when describing the actions of the Egyptian regime. And so various governments have been very critical. Whereas there isn't as much action to go with those words, that leads me really to my last point of the issue about the governments. I think it's instructive to behold that exercise. Psychologists, social psychologists, talk about something called othering. Othering is the process of describing and holding the other as other. That is, we are all different, but you're all the same. We judge ourselves by our best intentions, but we judge you by your actions, because you're fundamentally different. And that's been one of my experiences over our year in office. When Europe or the United States addressed the presidency of Mohammed Morsi, we were expected to do wonders. We were expected to transform the human rights situation within, overnight. We were expected to introduce and maintain gender equality at the touch of a button, really, with a wave of a magic wand of some sort. We were supposed to bring about stability in terms of street demonstrations, improve police methods, which are brutal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we were expected to do that because we were the government. And yet, when you turn around now and you speak to those self-same governments about their perspective on what is happening, there's no dispute about the terrible, unprecedented, to use the words of the Council of Europe, unprecedented repression that is going on in Egypt right now. And yet, they're quite comfortable saying, but we're in a difficult spot because the situation is complicated. That's othering. Othering is to say, I can excuse my actions because the situation is very difficult and we have such little influence and we can do so very little, and it is important to remain engaged. Now, those are all phrases that people use, but we agree with you, it's a terrible situation. But when it comes to your own practice, you should have done this and this and this and this and this with considerably fewer resources and considerably less power and influence even within the local situation. To close, what should we do in Canada? I would argue that in Canada we are fortunate enough to have probably the least interest in terms of geopolitical interest in the Middle East or in Canada or in Egypt of all the major allies. And that affords us the privilege of actually standing on principle. The world will survive in the broadest sense, only if we are able to come to conflicts. A world without rules, a world in which conflicts are resolved by through force or through power, is a world that will end very badly. We see this in Ukraine. We have seen this throughout the last century, and I don't think any of us here need to be instructed about this point. And so what we need to stand for, and what we need to stand in support of, is the rule of law. Governments do not change hands through military coups. Governments do not get removed at the whims of generals. Democracy can never be brought in on the backs of tanks or at the points of bayonets and guns. It's a very important point to make. It's a very important point for a middle power like Canada to stand by, to propagate, to push hard for, because fundamentally, even if we look simply at self-interest, if we are ever in a position where we are in conflict with a larger country, be that our neighbors to the south, be that China, be that the Arctic, we will want to be able to resort to the rule of law. And when we refuse, when we ignore the imperative of doing so, standing in principle for the rule of law for others, then others also refuse or see themselves able to not do the same for us when we have that need. The rule of law is the key to world stability, and Canada has a long and proud tradition of pushing for that and supporting that, and that is a tradition we should not undermine or abandon at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haddara. Now, many of you, and this question we hear all the time, so what are you asking for? What is the ECCD or the Egyptian community in Canada asking for? For that, I'm going to ask Ihab Latayef to come and say a few words and wrap up.
It is really difficult to find something to say after all what we have heard today from the wonderful speakers that spoke here, or those who spoke by video or by recorded footage, which I thank all very much, and I send my support to Sarah in particular. We can't say we're all in your shoes, but we all support you and feel with you, and your struggle is a part of our struggle, and we all come out together, either winners or losers. The Egyptian-Canadian Coalition for Democracy has been established on a non-partisan, non-ideological basis. It is a coalition that exists in most provinces across Canada, in BC, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, in Quebec, to call for the establishment or the return of a real democratic system in Egypt that respects human rights, that respects the rights of minorities and majorities, because sometimes the rights of majorities as well are trampled by the dictatorship. We want to see an Egypt where human rights are respected, and where real democracy, inclusive democracy, democracy that is rooted in the belief of every individual in the country exists. That is what we want to see, and that's what we stand for. We believe that the rights of the individual cannot exist except if the whole society stands together and believes that it will go with a system that respects human rights of all. So we here as a coalition of Egyptians and those who care about Egypt in Canada are playing in our own playing field, which is the Canadian society, the Canadian political environment. We are wondering, and we keep wondering, and I don't really find anything to add after all what was said today. We are wondering, what is our government doing, giving credibility to this regime in Egypt, by our foreign minister being the only foreign minister of any country to visit Egypt and to deal with that illegal, inhumane government that exists there. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? How are they allowing themselves to do that? It is a question that the answer eludes me personally, and that cannot be explained or justified when the Prime Minister of Egypt goes to the smallest unheard of African countries to do state visits just to say that somebody is receiving him. While at the same time, the Foreign Minister of Canada goes and visits Egypt and gives it credibility. I don't care what they say. I think this is wrong, and Canada should be much bigger and much stronger and much more conscientious than that. So I will close by saying that we and you should keep our voices heard, should be continuing to talk to all elected individuals and government people in this country to say that we can only choose one of two things. Either we stand with democracy and human rights, or we be branded as a country that supported a military dictatorship, and that is not how or what we should be as a country. I thank you very much for being here, and I hope to hear from you in the question and answer period. And I would really like to say that in closing, we as Egyptian Canadian Coalition for Democracy will continue our work till democracy returns to Egypt. This is a setback, but it's not the end of the road. We will continue on this path till democracy comes back to Egypt. Thank you very much.
The next session is going to be Q&A, and the gloves are off. We're going to have three speakers that will be taking your questions, and Dr. Nadia kindly agreed to moderate the session. After that, we hope to go for about 20 minutes. After that, we'll give you a chance, for those who didn't have a chance to visit our complimentary buffet, to do that, and hopefully exchange contact information. So I'll leave you in the capable hands of Dr. Nadia Abu-Zahra.
Bonsoir encore. Hello everyone again. So I welcome you to write your questions down on the cards provided and to return them to the ushers passing through the room so that we can collect them here and the responses can come rapid fire from our illustrious speakers. Yeah.
I have many questions, but I'll try to keep it down for time. In terms of what the Canadian government can do, I'm actually more curious to know what we can do locally, because what's been clear for me in my own role, sort of writing with these issues, is that even with amongst Egyptians, even just within the city, there actually isn't a unified understanding of what's going on. I mean, I watched a fight break out in front of a mosque, you know, while handing out papers. It was, you know, and I could understand the Arabic enough to know that it was a fight between Egyptians who were Muslim, who really, I guess what I'm seeing is that there's almost this sense that to be supporting human rights in this situation might mean having to take a side politically, which people do not want to do. Because again, this has been a long history, and you know, again, for a society to get to a point where it's so distrustful, it's more than just media. So I'm wondering what locally people can be doing to build community and build bridges here, because clearly the diaspora influences back home just as back home influences here. So how can we work to build bridges here?
Hilary, do you mind if I ask you to start and then we'll move on?
I mean, from my perspective, as someone who's campaigned on human rights for decades, I do that without taking a side and always have. I mean, the reality is whoever's committing human rights violations, I'm criticizing them even if I'm sitting right beside them, and I've certainly been on panels where that's happened. I work on policing issues, I've sat beside, police chiefs and that sort of thing too. And I think we always have to have the courage to do that. What people can do locally, I mean, I think you can always talk to your MP. You could always hold events where you try to bring people together to talk about issues. I mean, one of the things, when you talk about othering, yeah, I see that. I work on a lot of crisis countries, and I see that all the time, where people just glaze over. And one of the challenges is to provide a sort of meeting place where people can talk about things without getting lost in the complexity of it. It's a real challenge when you're trying to build bridges in Canadian society. People think, well, I've never been to Egypt, so can I talk about it? I've never been to Egypt. Lord knows that doesn't stop me from talking about human rights violations. What I do is I get out and talk to a lot of people, and I think that sometimes you can be the facilitator in ways you may have not realized. But fundamentally, it's getting people talking. I think whatever we can do to get people to find their common ground and see the humanity in each other, and that can be a really tough thing. But if we don't even try, then we stay divided and we don't move ahead. We don't start on that change that takes a very long time, but we have to start somewhere. So that's some of what I would say. I mean, events like this, I also found, at one point I was trying to start a project involving the graffiti that was used in Egypt. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, it didn't go ahead. But it had great potential as being the place where people could talk about things. So finding maybe the thing that isn't immediately divisive to bring people into the room is the other thing I recommend, and often that sort of art and expression as a way to bring people together.
Thank you for that creativity. Truly interesting to use graffiti to bring people together.
I mean, it was amazing stuff. I mean, and it's still being done every day. So yeah.
Phenomenal. We have a very important question. I'm going to point this toward Ihab as one of the spokespersons of the two organizing associations here, Amnesty International and the Egyptian-Canadian Coalition for Democracy. Ihab, the question is, are you supporting applying Sharia laws in Egypt?
I don't think that this question has at all to do with the topic we are discussing today. We as Egyptian Canadian, I'm here representing the Egyptian Canadian Coalition for Democracy, and as I said, we are supporting the establishment of a real democracy in Egypt that respects human rights of every and each individual in the country on the basis of citizenship, equal citizenship of all citizens of the country. Far from being an advocate of any religious or political ideology, we live here in Canada as full citizens of this country, and the rights of majority and minority individuals in Canada is I would like to say is an ideal model for us, but it is a model for us that we would like to see in Egypt. I believe that the situation in Egypt is subject, as it's portrayed to the world, with a lot of misleading and misconceptions that are intentionally placed to serve certain interests, and that's what I'm trying to tell people to stay away from. This question, I don't believe, is really a question or an issue within the situation in Egypt right now. It's I would call a trick question, actually, that I would not like to explore further, because it has no place in the current debate in Egypt.
Thank you, Ihab. The next question is in French. Ne pensez-vous pas que c'est à la population égyptienne de changer le système de l'intérieur pour apporter la démocratie? Le Canada n'a qu'un pouvoir assez limité pour pouvoir agir concrètement. In other words, we as Canadians and we as the Canadian government have a very limited sphere of influence in Egypt as compared to the Egyptian population itself? Ahab wants to take this one too. Way to go.
I mean, we can add on this, but I'll take this one and say, it is true, and it will always be true, that the people of every country or any country are the ones who will finally determine what happens in there. But I will not belittle or reduce the influence a country like Canada can play regarding the situation in Egypt or in any other country. I remember how Canada, and particularly under the Harper government over the last 8 years, set the tone and set the direction, the position of many Western countries took and became a reality after that. In particular, the incident when Israel attacked Lebanon with extreme force and devastated the infrastructure of the country in a very brutal attack, where Canada started the tone by saying that Israel's response is a measured response and set the tone that way, and thus many other countries followed suit. The same thing happened when the Palestinian Authority held one of the really best free elections in the Middle East, and Hamas, to the non-liking of Canada and many countries in the Western world, came up on top, and then democracy became something that's not desired really anymore, and Canada was the first country, even before Israel I would say, to announce that it's boycotting the newly formed Palestinian government, and again set the tone again as democracy. So I don't want to belittle the role a country like Canada, or Canada in particular, can play for or against human rights in a country like Egypt.
I promise I'm not ignoring Professor Haddara. Hilary wanted to step in on this question also. Just to add that there is one last sentence within it for Hilary. Le changement est fait par les Égyptiens et non par les acteurs extérieurs.
Okay,
So
I
it's
think
not
that's-
external actors, it's Egyptians.
Yeah, my French isn't that bad. It's mostly sports related, that's all. Just to say that, yeah, I mean, people do determine their own future, but we live in a much more interconnected world than we ever have. And so we really aren't islands. And there are people who want to express solidarity and offer concrete assistance. And I think, you know, those things need to come together in our world. The Canada middle power stuff, I get it, you know, we're a small country. However, I think the more you buy into that as a way of explaining silence, it's not a good thing. It just reinforces sort of extremes of power if the middle just sort of sits there and says, well, we can't do anything. And when the we can't do anything looks like two particular things, I think it's really bad. When it's silence, it's awful, because silence actually, it's a thing. It's a choice not to say something. A couple of things that Canada has done on some of the cases you mentioned, they have really bothered me. One is some of the commentary on Mohammed Fahmy's case, the journalist facing trial, and of course Khaled El-Kazaz's case, where he's not even charged yet. But we have a government saying, yes, you know, we're paying attention, we're taking a look at these things, but the justice system has to unfold as it is in Egypt. And that kind of commentary drives me nuts, because it's not a fair system. And to sort of say, well, you know, there's nothing we can do, it has to unfold, is to give it credibility in its fundamental unfairness. And it doesn't take much to say, we're concerned about that system. I mean, if you want to give aid and so on to help it improve and so on, but to just sort of say it, as our government has on a number of cases of Canadian citizens and Canadian residents detained abroad, to say, well, you know, we have to let the system unfold, without clearly saying it's an unfair system. You know, the size of your country doesn't matter. It's the right thing to say, and we should be saying it, and that matters.
Merci bien.
Sorry.
So, you know, what I've said to, what I keep saying to European countries as well as the Americans, and what I would say to you is that this is not about Egypt. So we are not asking, as someone who represented the government of Egypt at one point in time, I would say we don't want other countries to impose on Egypt a particular resolution. It is absolutely correct that any resolution to what's happening in Egypt has to be by Egyptians. And so this is not about that influence, this is about what our countries stand for. So what does Canada stand for? One of the conversations that we used to have with some regularity with myself and Khaled Pizzaz and others in the Foreign Relations Office of the Presidency was whether it is naive in international relations. And I think it can be done, but it's not a unilateral thing. It's not one country trying to do it and everybody else just, invades and uses tanks and whatnot. So for us in Canada, as Canadians, the question should be, what would we do as individuals? So how do we want our representatives to reflect that onto the world stage? The fact that we do have potentially little influence, potentially, I agree with Hilary's point, should make it easier, not more difficult to do what is right. We have nothing to lose, then it's far easier to do the difficult thing. The ultimate consequence, the logical consequence of building a world based on hypocrisy is that we bequeath to our children a world in which they cannot live.
We are now halfway through our question period. I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank all of you. We are going to continue questions, but I just think that it's very, very important to make sure how much appreciated it is that in this audience we have people who came by invitation and specifically people who represent our Canadian government. That is absolutely crucial. People who represent human rights in our Canadian government. People who are across the spectrum, who represent our members of parliament, our Senate, all from British Columbia, from the East Coast, from Central Ottawa, from across Canada. I want to thank each and every one of you, but also I'm sure on behalf of the organizers, I'm saying thank you for being here. Thank you for your... Some have framed the situation of Egypt as being a choice between a military dictatorship and a religious fascism, and say that it is not a surprise for Western governments to side with the military, which is the lesser of the two evils. How do you respond? How do you answer the charge that the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to prevent any future democratic transition?
So this is something that comes up, quite regularly, and what is being asked, of course, is should, from their perspective, from the perspective of the questioner, should we risk that the Muslim Brotherhood or other, whatever the flavor of the day, kill democracy slowly, or should we kill it quickly? Right? So should we take a risk that it's one man, one vote, one time, in the lexicon of the anti-Islamists, or should we just say no vote ever? Because really what is happening today, I don't know how many people are following the Sharon, that's the Egyptian presidential elections. The estimates, eyewitness accounts, and this is across the country, irrespective of who's speaking, are pegging turnout at somewhere between 4 and 7%. So I think the question answers itself, that if the objective is democracy, there was a democratically elected president, and that democratically elected president was pushing his hardest to have further elections. And it was the deep state, led by the Supreme Constitutional Court, that was trying very hard to obstruct those elections. And yet someone actually has the ability to frame this as democracy versus no democracy, or military coup versus religious fascism. So, I think that this situation answers itself.
This is my last question here, so if you have a question.
Maybe I'll just fire off. And again, this might sound idealistic and naive, but as George Bernard Shaw once said, the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. And so we need to be a little bit unreasonable here and say, no, we insist on fighting for what we believe is right, to stand for what we believe is ethical, to assert what we believe is the truth. And in our world, in our time today, if we keep doing this, we will make it so. This is a very individual obligation that has nothing to do with consequences. We may fail in terms of changing the world, but we will not change in having done the right. We will not have failed in terms of having done the right thing.
Absolutely.
Just to close, on Saturday there was a fairly monumental event for those who are watching Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid. and
Common ground, sports.
there we go. And it was 1-0, in regulation time, injury time, the seconds were ticking. If you were Real Madrid, you could choose to give up. And that would have been entirely reasonable. The Canadians are playing today, they're down 3-1. You can choose to give up. Every individual human being has the choice of giving up. And that's not what we're going to do.
We have 2 more questions. We'll hear the questions and then we'll allow each person on the panel to have a last word in response to those questions, in response to all. And that should bring us to 2 minutes before closing. So we have very few minutes left. Next question.
First, I'd like to thank the panelists. It's been very informative. I'd like to just ask any one of the panelists to follow up on a statement that's, I guess, come up during the discussion. And that's the statement that Canada has no geopolitical interests in Egypt. And it's interesting. I've never heard that framed in quite that way before. And I'm wondering if we might want to dissect that a little bit, at least for the parliamentarians and politicians who may have thought otherwise. And I guess that's the question, if we could just dissect that.
Okay, and there was one last question there, and then we're on to our last ones.
Thank you very much for this panel. Definitely, I would like to take the chance we have modern people working in academia here. So my interest with the people, with the students who are killed every day inside the campuses. We see every day the violation against the students in different campuses across Egypt. My question is politically and technically, what Canada can do to stop this daily bloodshed fighting against those students every day? So thanks a lot for General.
Hilary, when you're ready. So, Amnesty International.
Oh, there's never a last word, but I'm actually going to take all 3, because I think it does tie together, what can individuals do? Part of what I said earlier is you can help raise awareness and provide sort of situations where people can talk about what's going on and find those moments of solidarity. I mean, perhaps something around the students, there is some solidarity thing there, who knows? But to get information out there, to get dialogue going, I think all of that is very important. Part of what Amnesty is well known for, and is something people can do, is to take up some of the individual cases. I think sometimes people really, there's one person right here who'd love your help. But in these situations, whether it's Egypt or Syria or the Central African Republic and so on, people glaze over at the huge numbers. And these are all situations where we talk about thousands of people in detention, and it can feel really hopeless. We're trying to get the message across about the scale of the violations. We have wall charts like this, and it causes a lot of people to turn off. In the end, it's a big dilemma for human rights campaigners. I tell you the severity, and you become disempowered. And I think one of the ways that we re-empower people is to get them involved in the individual cases that highlight these actions, and we have seen substantial change. And I think people, if people are looking for what to do, that is something they can do that brings it back to the humanity of all this. Because when you lose that sense of humanity, it's when people just sort of walk away from change and walk away from hope and decide not to talk to each other anymore. So I think whether it's the students and how to help them get the word out, find a way, this kind of thing. But the Canada and the geopolitical stuff, it drives me nuts. I run into MPs at airports, and And they said the same thing around the Central African Republic. And my answer was exactly what somebody said is, well, I think you said it, well, hey, well, that gives you a really good chance to do the right thing then. Because you don't have all the excuses of your various national interests that get in the way. You don't have clutter, so why aren't you doing something? I don't actually believe that there's a situation where geopolitical interests don't exist because we are so interconnected, but I think we really have to encourage people to rise above it. That can sound naive, but we have to strive for it, because when we give up, where are we?
Professor Haddara, might I exclude you from the last word? Okay, he's given me consent. And he had a last word before our final wrap-up.
First, I would say I don't really agree totally that Canada has no interest. I mean, maybe compared to the United States, maybe compared to some European countries, it has less interest. But I would bring it out to the open that I believe strongly that Canada has a lot of interest in the region. Canada, the current Canadian government at least, has Israel's interests in mind very much, maybe sometimes before Canadian interests, and that plays directly in the situation in Egypt. So Canada is playing very cautiously and looking at certain interests. Also, commerce has no limits, and I think the Harper government is very much focused in establishing whatever it can find as commercial interests everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter how many human rights are trampled upon on the road to that. And Egypt is still a big market, and the Middle East is still a big market, and Egypt is still a major player there. So does that become a reason to sell out the rights of the Egyptian people to live in a democratic, human rights respecting environment in Canada's eyes? Of course not. It shouldn't. And but the calculations of those in power here may be different at this point. What we can do, I'll talk on the individual level. I think what we can do, each and every one of us, is not accept the lies that we hear in the media, that we keep getting told, to speak back, to write the normal things, write a letter to the editor, at least even when you get on a water cooler argument, know what to say and say it. Say what you know and know what you're saying, and that way you'll change the point of view. The Egyptian environment that I grew up in, and I'll close with this, grew up in, and here I come back to the discussion in front of the mosque. The Egyptians have grown up not to know how to deal with differences. There was my generation at least, with one opinion, point of view. They come and speak. There were two football teams, going back to sports. You're either supporting one or the other, and inside the family, all the family supported one. So there was never division inside the family. Now there are divisions inside every family in Egypt. So the dynamics are very different. And as Egyptians, we need to learn how to deal with this. And as non-Egyptians, we need to speak out about what's right and what's wrong, and speak it out loud and clear.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
I'm going to recap these three positions. Professor Haddara stands for Real Madrid and says,
Actually, I don't.
For the record. Do the right thing. Amnesty International reminds us that it starts with one person. So staffers, s'il vous plaît, faire attention à Madame Atia avec nous et demander une rencontre entre votre représentante ou représentant avec Madame Atia. Just to start. And third, the importance of the principle of inclusion coming from IHAB, saying that this is not about any particular faith, it's not about any particular policy or politics or any sort, it's simply about inclusion, all humans, to stand for human rights.
Thank you very much. In closing, some of the articles that I hope you will read in your folders ask certain questions. Robert Fisk asks when a coup is not a coup, or when is a coup not a coup? And he answers, only when it happens in Egypt. Another article you will read, if it's a coup in Thailand, why isn't it a coup in Egypt? Dalia Fahmy, in another article, tells us that the military junta is redefining authoritarianism in Egypt. And Haroon Siddiqui ends it in another article says that Mr. Harper thinks that General Fattah Sisi is so peachy. So what's the conclusion? The revolution continues and our struggle with our Canadian government continues. Thank you all very much for being with us tonight. I hope we managed to intellectually stimulate you, challenge your mindset, and hopefully piqued your interest into finding out a little more about what we do and what you can do. And I wish I can actually say that this is going to be our last encounter, but the chances are we'll be seeing you in our future events. We are out of time, and I thank the speakers very much for being so disciplined. I was actually so worried because whenever I gestured to them this way, I thought to myself, what if they actually think I'm saying victory, but I was saying 2 minutes. They all understood it. So I'm going to give you the last couple of minutes to visit the buffet and intermingle and exchange contacts. Thank you again very much and have a wonderful evening.